Every Day the Same Dream is one of those 2D flash games largely forgotten with the passing of time. But just because it's not remembered, swept under the rug by people who are now exploring AAA titles or various other indie games, doesn't mean ignorance of its existence should be continued. Certainly, when I played the game and then finished the game, I found it initially of interest, and later, when looking back on what it all meant, what the game was trying to say, I came to a rather fascinating conclusion. In this video game, the story is about a man, nobody out of the ordinary, just your typical wage laborer at a dull computing company, who has an extremely repetitive and boring life, miserably so. He repeats the same day, over and over again, getting out of bed, putting on his clothes, and going to work away some hours for the profit of his private owner, the capitalist who runs the business. He makes all the money while the guy you play as, just your typical proletarian Joe, is left with a very dull standard of living, never climbing the ladder he presumably pictured himself to as a kid. From this perspective, seeing how sad, tedious, and absence of vigor in life his whole situation is, getting completely screwed over by the capitalist mode of production, we might form a Marxist analysis of the story in question. It was my first impression, and I can't blame anyone who does, especially considering that there's no confirmed truth about the game's story. You can have endless interpretations of it. Nobody's objectively correct or incorrect, just that there exists different ways of viewing the world, the different paths undertaken by every conceivable individual, and the results they lead to. In the case of Every Day the Same Dream, our proletarian protagonist is clearly unhappy with his life, as noted by the lack of color, emotion, or adequate treatment from his employer. While it's important and healthy to bring to light the evil torture that is capitalism, and of hierarchical relationships in the traditional workplace, past the point of the Industrial Revolution, this isn't going to be a socialist spin on the story. Indeed, I have an alternative hypothesis for what the game represents, its bleakness and melancholy overtones. The repetition made obvious, not merely as part of the story, but also part of the gameplay, as you're forced to repeat the same actions again and again, causing you to feel somewhat tired. To note, this might be considered a flaw in the Flash game itself, but nonetheless something which further develops the hypothesis, is representation of how nothing ever changes, alters, gives way. This sentiment is understandable and relatable to anyone who doesn't own a means of production, especially if they live in the urban industrialized world, where they have an access to agricultural tools to employ themselves. Every day is the same as the last, and the only way to break the cycle is to deviate from the norm. This is made possible by means of 5 steps, allowing you to get the game's ending. In whichever order you want to do them in, you have to show up without enough clothes on for work, which gets your boss to fire you. You have to pick up a leaf. You have to pet a cow you find after getting out of your car midway to work, as you've discontinued driving. You have to walk left at one point and encounter a mysterious homeless guy who takes you to a graveyard. And you have to jump, presumably to your death, at the edge of your company's building. Now, 4 out of 5 of these things are extremely adventurous, out of the ordinary for everyone, but especially bored-to-death wage laborers who typically be afraid to break the slightest normalities. Showing up half-naked to work, getting out of your car midway to pat a cow, traveling to a graveyard with a homeless stranger, and plummeting to your death, these are all extremely weird things that require quite a lot of personal strength to undertake. Picking up a leaf is almost meaningless, however, so that one's crossed out. Some might add, at close inspection, that committing suicide, one of the 4 I listed as courageous, is explicitly opposed to the theoretical principles of fascism. Yes, this is true, for fascism considers suicide to be a cowardly act, and that each man should love his life, or at least aspire to make an effort. That's out of the way. It's still incredibly courageous, the most daring out of all the acts that cause progress to be made in the game. One can interpret this leap of faith, or alternatively phrased, leap of death, to be the decision made by our proletarian protagonist fleeing from the clutches of the capitalist class. But another suggestion would be that he wished not to continue in a world of modernity, decadence, and the crippling cosmopolitanism running rampant. I mean, it could be both, why not? Anyway, the point is, even though suicide isn't quite fascistic, quite the opposite, it represents man's departure from the material world and into the spiritual realm. Man's desperate longing for a new life that's shaped by a higher state of consciousness. The lack of attachment to the material world in fascism is not only a rejection of modernity in favor of spirituality, but it's also a revolt against the modern world in its other aspects, such as the ontological defilement that arrived with early philosophers and contemporary academics, claiming existence possesses a physical character, that it's not metaphysically a construction of the mind, something independent from tangible objects and theoretical notions. To quote Giovanni Gentile, the prime theoretician of actual idealism, idealism is a faith in an ideal reality that must be sought. It's one thing to think the ideal, to fantasize the world, your personal situation, getting better. But it's another thing entirely to actualize the ideal, not to merely dream of it, but to implement it. What existed in fascist Italy was a perfect example of this idealistic actualization. Benito Mussolini, just one man, marched on Rome and demanded a democratic Italy surrender its will and might to what he yielded, his strength, with his fellow black shirts. Most men can only dream of what Mussolini achieved, yet he did it anyway. The ideal was the reality not only sought, but made part of existent consciousness, formed to become real, believed in by all nationals of Italy, and with his power put to use, he made the men and women of Italy want to live forever. Suicide was cowardly. Death was cowardly. Lying down while the world moved with might around you, it was nothing except the pathetic will of a dispossessed body, not just introduced to the corporative structure of binding together all spiritual beings. The man you play in the game is not merely dreaming of life getting better, he's making it better, he's doing things he's never done before. To chase after an ideal reality is one thing, and to bring it into reality is another. But the fact that your body corresponds to that of your mind, and thus your political consciousness on this earth, you've separated yourself from the needless desires your physical figure produces, and are instead living accordingly to the ideal, the truth, the ultimate, non-contradictory rationality of action. Everything is action, everything is movement and burnt-out energy. Life in fascism is a constant string of vigor, of passion, of national heroism, and nothing less. Whenever you attempt or complete a step in every day the same dream, you're actualizing the ideal. And when the game's about to end, when you see either yourself or someone who works at the same company as you, who looks like you, as all workers in your company are indistinguishable from yourself, about to jump off the edge, and jumps, you understand this symbolizes national rebirth. The term pelagianesis refers to rebirth or recreation, the extreme, drastic, never forgettable alteration from the olden world to a newer world. In the context of fascism, it's the nation which changes, and with it, the people the nation swallows as a unified collective, transcending the physical world and entering into a higher, spiritual sphere. The nation has fallen into defilement, into an age of darkness. It can, however, be reborn if the people are willing to believe in it, to be fused with the national spirit, the energy which resonates with a particular sovereign country. Palingenetic ultra-nationalism is a key component within fascist philosophy, the conception of a new way of life, a different, superior style of living and striving, that's born from the ashes of the outdated, culturalist realm of materialism and consumerism, that treasures only the shifting politics of environments, and not unique groups which inhabit such environments. Such interest groups are given dual weight in the corporative state. The phoenix is a bird which fades away with age, and when it's sizzled into a pile of ashes, is reborn, resurrecting a younger, prettier version of itself. This is a nation for fascism. The death of you or your coworker in every day the same dream symbolizes the rebirth of yourself or someone else, maybe the entire staff of the company, and creates new men from the ashes of the old. The nation is reborn, eternally altered and blessed with the spiritual virtues it wishes it always had. Of course, that's just one way of viewing things. There is no fixed answer to what the game means. The developers intended its message to be. Is rebirth beautiful? I certainly believe it is. I don't think, however, the developers were fascists or anything, that they saw their nation declining with modernity and multiculturalism or anything similar. They might have even intended the game to have an internationalist character, the opposite of what I'm putting forth. But, I guess, as far as interpretations go, the idea of death displaying the turning of the vicious tides, the soft, slumbering image of the nation, planted firmly in the minds of its subjects yet again, it's a pretty nice way of seeing things.